Welcome to the show. You are listening to SashaTalksTech, a podcast about technology, innovation, and leadership. My name is Sasha Prokhorova. I'm an engineer and a language analyst. In today's episode, we're going to reflect on the recently observed ramifications of the COVID-19 pandemic, a tremendous spike in unemployment claims as multiple industries that depend on human interaction ceased to exist overnight. Millions filed for unemployment during the shelter-in-place order. According to NBC, the coronavirus outbreak made America's job market go from 60 to 0 in a blink of an eye. This unprecedented event of global health emergency, coupled with the approaching threat of the economic crisis, resulted in the EDD website outages due to the overload that was never previously observed. And during these trying times, it's natural for the public to be looking for a scapegoat. Why not blame a tool that was invented and introduced into the mainframes of major financial institutions more than half a century ago? To comply with this zeitgeist, also known as the spirit of time, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest, Tom Ross, also known as Captain COBOL from IBM. Tom is a senior software engineer in IBM COBOL development. Tom has spent his entire 36-year IBM career in COBOL development, working on the compiler and runtime libraries for every release of COBOL. He is an expert when it comes to understanding migration challenges for enterprise COBOL and language environment. He understands many of the issues facing IBM mainframe customers today. And most importantly, Tom will explain why COBOL is not the culprit of what we're observing now, and that why this crisis is very much misinterpreted. So what caused such an urgent need for COBOL? Could it be the current crisis caused by the coronavirus pandemic, or has the need always been there? It was just exacerbated by the crisis.
It depends on what you're talking about, the urgent need. I mean, it's in the news because of the massive numbers of people applying for unemployment insurance. So it's overloaded some of the state's unemployment insurance departments. And then the first one was New Jersey, and the governor didn't even know how to say COBOL. He called it Cobalt. And he said that they needed programmers because their COBOL system was slow. But it turns out that he was wrong, that it was the web front ends that were overloaded, their web servers. The COBOL was okay. So it's really unfortunate. It's just incorrect information. But it spread like wildfire, and a bunch of other states have said as well. Ohio just told me the other day that their COBOL batch, the mainframe part, the back end of their unemployment insurance system is running fantastically. It's the shining star, even though their unemployment system is totally overloaded because of all the coronavirus requests. But it's not the COBOL that's the problem. However, that's what got into the news, and so everyone's talking about it. And then people like to, it's the most popular language to bash, and people love to say that COBOL is old and bad. And so everyone's got on their horses, on their soapboxes, and started talking negative things about COBOL.
Yeah, I've been very curious about the reasons of why COBOL has such a bad reputation. I've done a little bit of research, and I noticed a lot of engineers love hating on it. So I was just wondering about the reason. Is it its high domain specificity? Because it's a very reliable high volume data processing language. However, it's not a general purpose language anymore. So I was just wondering, could that be the reason?
That's an interesting point. Is it a general purpose language? It depends on what you mean. For example, Java was designed specifically for mobile devices. So, but do people consider that a general purpose language? I don't know. I think COBOL can do everything except system programming, and that's what I see it being used for. It's very curious. I just gave a presentation yesterday about this because from the very beginning, as soon as COBOL was born, people started hating on it. There was a famous computer scientist named Dijkstra, and he said that COBOL was the worst thing that ever happened to computer science. And I think he kind of started it. But even IBM said when we came out with PL1 in the late 60s that was going to take over from COBOL. And there have been announcements of, well, C++ will take over, or Java will take over, and now Swift or Node.js or one of these other newer things. But the fact of the matter is that there have been many programs written in COBOL, and way too many for them to ever go away. My email closing is COBOL is the language of the future. And it's a little bit, it's kind of a two-edged meaning, because one is, even if all of the companies who are relying on COBOL, and that is all of the companies, if you name a large company, all banks, all state governments, federal governments, international governments, the Dutch Tax Association, Royal Canada Bank, Wells Fargo, State Farm Insurance, every single large entity runs their business on COBOL on mainframe. Even if they all decided to quit using COBOL today and started rewriting their COBOL into Swift or Perl or whatever, Java, put your latest technical fashion language name here, it would take 30 years or more to rewrite all those programs. There are so many.
Because I heard there are billions of lines of COBOL code that exist that are used by major financial institutions. Our ATM transactions depend on it, and a lot of POS transactions as well. So yeah, I was wondering, would it be, of course it would be the cost of starting everything from scratch that could be a deterrent, but also the issue must be safe data migrations, because theoretically, if we were to have a transition from it, it's nearly impossible, not even just costly, to create the pipeline for that data migration. And an engineer who would to conduct such a migration would be equally as fluent in COBOL and Java or whatever modern language we would use for that. So you would think it's just the reason for cost, or just practicality?
There's many reasons. One of the reasons why it's going to be around forever is because of the sheer the weight of it, the momentum, what do I want to say? It's too hard to move. I have customers, individual customers with 50,000 COBOL programs, and everyone has more than 5,000 lines in them. So to rewrite those would be tremendous. And then, as you said, some of them are processing something called VSAM files with read and write, which is kind of an old way of accessing data. So the database isn't a hierarchical database or relational database. It's just flat files, we call them, just files. And you can't process files in many languages. So in those cases, you'd have to do mass conversion of the data. And anytime you make any change to an application, there's a risk of breaking it. And if I'm a large company, like I'm a bank and I'm processing 50 million transactions per day, if I start having an error in one, I'm going to have 50,000 errors per second, ruining everything. So they're very, very cautious to even change one line of code. Their applications work today. If you rewrite an application in a new language, it's going to have bugs, it's going to have fewer features, and it's not going to perform as well. And it's going to cost you millions of dollars to do that. So then the question becomes, why would I want to do that?
Yeah, it could cause a butterfly effect for no reason. Because why fix something that's not broken? Because COBOL is a perfectly fine language. I thought the reason it causes so much disdain in the media, I thought maybe the syntax is complex, but it is not. I actually looked over it, and it's very readable. It looks like very practical, almost like a human language.
Yes, it's designed to be English-like. And then I'm glad that you did that, because that is the purpose of, one of the goals of the design was that anyone could read the COBOL. And so like a manager of programmers at a bank could read the programs and see if they're doing what he wants them to do. Whereas if you have C programs, a non-programmer is never going to understand a C program or a Java class or things like that. But anyone can read COBOL and understand it. And so that's a beautiful thing. So if I have to come in and work on someone else's COBOL program, I can understand it very quickly. Personally, I have worked with C a whole bunch, and it's just not that natural for me. I can figure it out, but it's nowhere near as easy as COBOL.
Yeah, I found C pretty counterintuitive myself. I myself write in Python mostly because it sounds more like a human language to me. And I think that's the reason why I'm interested in COBOL so much, because that's what COBOL and Python have in common. It's very high interpretability. And as you said, anybody can read and understand and debug COBOL. It doesn't even have to be an engineer. It could be accountant. It could be an executive, or it could be pretty much any of the worker in the office. So yeah, that's why I was confused. I couldn't figure out why people don't like COBOL this much.
Yeah, who knows? I don't know how to speculate about why people don't like COBOL. But I wanted to show you this chart. I just gave this presentation today. This is something that a lot of people don't know. And this is a chart from a mainframe tool called CICS, or CICS. It's a transaction processing tool used by, for example, many banks, or like if I go to if I call an insurance company and I want to get insurance, they would create an account for me, and creating an account would be a transaction. So they'd put in my name and specific information, and then submit a request to create an account, and that would be a transaction. So CICS is the #1 transaction processor in the world, and so here's some numbers that are just really amazing to think about. If you think about the number of people picking up their smartphone and Google searching on, what's the name of the actor in some movie, or who did such and such a song, or how old is the Queen of England? We're Google searching all day long. There are about 60,000 Google searches per second globally in the world every day, 60,000 per second. But there are 1.1 million CICS transactions per second every day, all day long. So it absolutely dwarfs the number of Google searches. And this is something that a lot of people don't realize. And those CICS transactions are mostly written in COBOL, somewhere above 90%. So what people don't realize is they are using COBOL every day. Every person on the planet uses COBOL every day, and sometimes many times a day. When you make a cell phone call, your cell phone minutes are tracked by COBOL programs on a mainframe. Your account is kept track of by COBOL programs accessing data on a mainframe, and then they send you a bill at the end of the month running COBOL programs to create the bills. And it's just an amazing secret that everything everyone does is COBOL. And they don't realize it. It's not in the news. There's no advertisements for ZOS. There's no commercials telling you to buy CICS or buy COBOL. It's there already, and it has been for 40 years.
Wow, this is fascinating. So it's basically a pillar our financial institutions are resting upon without people even realizing it. Because I remember I was chatting to a friend of mine about it, and we talked about COBOL. And I called him asking for the opinion about COBOL and programming in general. And he is from Czech Republic. So he was like, oh, COBOL, why do you want to unleash this ancient dragon? But turns out it's almost offensive to COBOL, because it could not be further from truth. It's very contemporary, it's widely used, and it's not an ancient, and it's not a dragon, because it doesn't take that much to tame it, as it turns out.
Yeah. Yeah, and all the Python programmers and Perl programmers and C programmers are actually using COBOL all day, every day. Not all day, but regularly. Whenever, you make a phone call, or you drive your car, or get a part for your car, the parts are tracked by COBOL. Airplanes are manufactured using COBOL programs. Automobiles, manufacturing of things like bridges and everything requires calculations, and a lot of this, pretty much anything you name that has to be done in society is done with COBOL. Pretty much, I'd say. There are always exceptions, but people would be amazed to find out about it.
Wow. So you would think basically the solution of everything that's going on right now is definitely not deviating away from COBOL, but rather training new COBOL engineers that would be familiar with the bugs and that would be able to fix them in case if they do have to occur in mainframe. Because the issue with that nowadays is that COBOL is no longer in the school curriculum even. So what is the future outlook of this?
Yeah, that's another myth that schools don't teach COBOL. There's over 180 universities in the world teaching COBOL today. And some of them have, the University of North Texas has some interesting information. They did a survey of their graduates, and they have a business computer information systems curriculum or major. And it was optional for those students to take COBOL classes in addition to their other computer science classes. And the graduates who chose to take the optional COBOL classes got an average of $10,000 more per year when they got jobs than the ones who didn't learn COBOL. And this is very recent information. So it is there are schools who don't teach COBOL, but there are a bunch of schools that do. IBM works very closely with schools. We have something we call the Academic Initiative to try to keep some knowledge sharing about mainframe and COBOL going on, because there are many, many jobs. The challenge is also, is university job training or mind expanding? What's the job of a university? And some of them don't really care if they're teaching practical things. They're teaching what they want to teach. And so they might not teach things that are relevant at all. They're not trade schools, for example, although that's how I treated college. I went to college to learn skills to get a job. And I think a lot of people do. But that's a whole, what's the purpose of college is kind of a challenge.
Yeah, I feel like especially for the engineers, it's true, because we go to college in order to use our skills immediately, every day. Everything we learn at school, we're expected to use in a workforce. So it could almost be like a trade school in certain regards.
Yeah. And and some of them don't want to be seen as trade schools. That's kind of below them or something. It's not something to be proud of. I don't know. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, because they're probably under impression that it doesn't appear as glamorous and it would take away from school image or something like this. Yeah, that's actually a really interesting topic to ponder over.
And the other challenge, I think, is that there's this view that technology is sort of influenced by the fashion of the day. What's the latest thing? The new is better than old, which is kind of crazy. If the world ran like that, we should stop using the wheel because that's old, and colleges shouldn't teach Latin because that's old. But there's it's frustrating for me. But there's a lot of good work going on, a lot of cooperation between corporations and universities coordinated by IBM. And we've gone into areas and said, that this company has a whole bunch of jobs for people with this kind of education. So if you start teaching COBOL, you will help people to get jobs in your community with these local companies. And the universities are open to this quite often. So it's been quite successful.
So that's excellent. That's very reassuring. Hopefully, it would generate some interest in COBOL among the new engineers that are about to come out and join the workforce. And I also noticed some companies offer free COBOL training for those who are interested. And if I'm not mistaken, IBM was one of them, right?
Yeah, we had some free COBOL training through a company called Interskill. They still do COBOL training today. And there's a lot of things you can learn by looking online. There's a lot of free information out there.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of courses. I noticed even the Udemy offers quite a few courses on COBOL because of all this newly generated interest.
Yeah. So it depends on, like, there was a question asked, why would someone want to learn COBOL? Well, if you want to get a job and have a long career with something, COBOL is an excellent choice. Then you get into this whole thing, this modern thing of nobody wants to work for a company for more than 4 years. They want to jump from company to company. And you can still do that with COBOL. But some people want to have a job and a career and stay in one place and raise a family and have a steady paycheck. And I think that's a very attractive, COBOL is a very attractive solution for those people.
So COBOL could be an instrument of reaching financial and social stability as opposed to holding you back as an engineer, as some people in tech are currently convinced.
Yeah. Yeah, and it depends. A lot of people like this whole thing about the mainframe. They don't realize how many people are working on it and how many people use it, how important it is to the world. You can't go out and buy a mainframe for your house, but you can buy a small Unix box or a Windows box, and you can write programs on it. And so you can be your own, kind of engineering company. And the mainframe doesn't have that ability. Although we're starting to do that in IBM, we're starting to have the ability to try it out. Free trials of a mainframe system. You can have days of access, things like that. But it's just not as commonly known. If you go into a computer store, they're not going to have anything about mainframe or COBOL in there. And so you might not ever find out. If you were just the average person, you could go through your whole life and not even realize how important COBOL is and never even hear about it. So it's a challenge.
So basically, the reason we don't deviate away from COBOL, it's not just bureaucratic inertia, like or a knowledge gap, as everyone is as a lot of people, I should say, are convinced, but it's rather the rock solid reliability of COBOL, of it being a pillar of this massive infrastructure. Because let's say hypothetically, if we were to rewrite the mainframe and migrate everything to the cloud, we would have to rewrite it again 10 years afterwards when new language and new technology comes out, and it's just not practical.
Yeah, that's right. And COBOL is ideal for business programming. It's designed for business programming, and most of the things that we rely on are business programming. But the other thing that's not well known is that COBOL is extremely fast. It's very, very high performance, and people don't think of it that way, but it's true. I once was tasked with the job of there's a database called DB2, which is across platforms. It's an IBM database. But it's a very, very popular on the mainframe. And a lot of these COBOL programs are accessing data on DB2. And they had a question of which programming language is the most efficient for accessing DB2. And is it the pure SQL language? Is it C? Is it Java? Or is it COBOL? At that time, those are the 4 ones they were interested in. And they didn't have someone to write the COBOL part, so they sent me the C program, and I rewrote it into COBOL. And I kind of knew this was going to happen, but it turned out that the fastest language was COBOL. The best performing language of all of them was COBOL. And they were kind of surprised as well. A lot of people just don't think of it as a high performance language. They think of it as old and for business and not that interesting. But in fact, it's there's a lot of it out there because it's so perfect for business and because it's so very fast and efficient.
Wow. Does it support comments?
Does it support what?
Comments. Like comments between the
comments
lines.
in the code?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, very much so. Yeah, and then, and in fact, we just added a few years ago a new feature of the latest COBOL standard. In fact, there's a new standard coming out in a few years for COBOL, but the most recent is 2014. And there's they finally added the capability to have comments on the same line as COBOL statements. Previously, comments were in comment blocks, so you'd have a series of lines where the whole line is comments, and then you'd have your COBOL programming statements, and then you'd have a block of comments. Now you can have also comments on the same line as COBOL. So definitely can have comments in COBOL.
So yeah, so COBOL did become very user-friendly, and it's reliable.
Yep, and fast. It's perfect.
So, but I was wondering, you remember all that frenzy around a year 2000 when people were terrified that it's going to cause a computer collapse? Because I believe back then, at least, COBOL only supported 2-digit format, if I'm not mistaken. To elaborate a little bit on that, if the person is born in year 1930, let's say, the year would be 30. But some people were born like in the previous century, or some people lived more than 100 years, let's say. Is it something that actually ended up causing problem with COBOL, or was it just a myth, something to instill fear in everyday life people?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I've had a lot of talk with my family about that. None of my family are engineers, and they wondered about this at that time too, like why all this hype? But in fact, it was a very real problem. But one of the things about mainframe people is they know how to plan for and avoid problems. And they knew it was coming, and they knew they had to fix it. It wasn't a fault of the oldest COBOL language, the compiler that we last released in 1982 did not support 4-digit years, but the later ones did support 4-digit years. However, when people were writing their programs in the 80s and even in the 90s, more in the 70s, I guess, but in the 80s, they weren't thinking about how long they would be around. They were trying to get I need to get this payroll application working so we can get the paychecks to our employees. And early programming, space was expensive, so they didn't want to have a bunch of 19s in front of the years, because it's always the same. Every date has 19 in it. It's not interesting. Then, of course, when we started approaching year 2000, that 19 was interesting, and we needed a 20.
So they went and modified the dates? Is that what happened?
They changed the dates or the code that was processing them. So if they were figuring out if someone's old enough to get a license, or old enough that their insurance is going to be canceled, we would subtract their birth date from the current date. And if you subtract 1950 from 2000, you get 50. If you subtract 50 from 00, you get minus 50, and you have a big problem.
And it would raise an error in the best case scenario.
Oh yeah, it might end or get the wrong answer. So they would change the code to many different ways. Sometimes they used 4-digit years. The data was typically all over the place with 2-digit years. So often what they did is something called year windowing, where they would say, if the year is 99 or less, then we'll assume it's a 1900. If it's 0 to 30, we'll assume it's a 2000 year. And so they would, they had a 100-year window that was sliding over the dates. And they'd have specific, well, if this is a birth date, then it's probably more likely to be a 2000 than if it's an age. And so in each case, they would have slightly different code to fix it. But it's really true that all of these programs had to be changed for year 2000, and they were. And they did a great job, and hardly anyone had any problems with year 2000. But I was giving a presentation this morning showing my first COBOL program that I wrote to teach myself COBOL, and it was funny that it was writing a graph of my running mileage, and I had hard-coded in it the year, so this is the month something of year 19 blank blank, and then I'd put the year in, after the 19. So my very first program had a year 2000 problem. Now, it wouldn't have failed. It just would have looked really stupid to say my running mileage in 2000 or in 1999 was 20 miles a week, and then in 1900, the next year, it was 24 miles a week. So
it would be counterintuitive.
Yes. So, but like you said, some of these calculations would actually stop the application if they weren't corrected for the year 2000 problem. So there was a lot of interest in it, and a lot of work got done, and I was heavily involved with my customers asking questions about things as they did the work. But they started in 1995, and the media was hyping it more around 1998, 1999 as it got closer. And by then, most of the code was already fixed, and the companies were in the middle of what they called year 2000 testing. So they did a great job, and we didn't have much problem at all.
Yeah, I remember everyone was like living in fear of the year 2000, wondering, oh, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And then nothing happened. There was no collapse.
Yeah, all the power is going to go off and bridges are going to collapse. And but nothing exciting happened at all.
No, nothing like that. So basically the need for COBOL engineers, it always existed. But do you think it even spiked recently, or is it an illusion? People are just talking more about COBOL.
I think it's just in the media. I know, like in there's a concept that you might have heard of called management by airline magazine, where executives will read airline magazines and get their technical knowledge there. And you would see articles about Java or even Python kind of things in there. The latest stuff, you never saw COBOL mentioned. But so then when it's in the news, everyone says, what the heck is COBOL? Why are people using COBOL? And they don't know anything. So they assume things, and then the news will spread that. And there are you can find a lot of video blogs and other writings on the internet about how it's crazy that people are still running COBOL. They shouldn't, and that is the problem, that they're still using COBOL, when in fact that couldn't be further from the truth.
Wow, I see. So it's basically a manufactured shortage just for media attention. I did not see that coming.
Yeah, it's interesting, and like I said, the state of Ohio unemployment insurance program is also it's overloaded with applications for unemployment insurance, but it's and they say, well, theirs is written in COBOL as well, of course, because everything's written in COBOL. But the COBOL part isn't the bottleneck; it's the web interface part. And we've heard many times when someone comes up with something new, and like they're going to do voting online, or people want to buy something new on some website, it will immediately, if there's a lot of activity, it will crash the website because the web server can't handle the traffic. And that seems to be the problem in these unemployment insurance things as well. Even though the governor of New Jersey tried to blame COBOL, it doesn't look like that was the problem at all. So it's misinformation that gets propagated by other people sharing the misinformation.
Wow, this is incredible, because I remember like a month and a half ago, whenever all this crisis began, LinkedIn exploded with hashtag COBOL, and people were blaming it for pretty much everything, on the delay on unemployment checks and crashing of the website. But turns out COBOL was not the culprit by no means. It was just a scapegoat.
Right. Yeah. It was JavaScript or who knows what, or not powerful enough web server hardware to handle the loads. Who knows what? There are people working on it, and actually IBM has volunteered to help. We're reaching out to a lot of these. Unemployment especially is getting hit. As you see in the news, there's a lot of people out of work now because of the stay-at-home rules. So there's a lot of unemployment activity, and so every state has the same problem where many people are applying for unemployment insurance more than ever, And so it's testing all these systems. And so IBM has reached out to these companies, these governments, to see if there's anything we can do to help. Can we help them analyze their system or figure out what might help, that kind of thing. So we are, and we also have COBOL programmers, we IBM, for hire. We have a global business services division where people can hire IBM to do almost anything to help with their IT. So we're making sure that they're available to people. We're also making databases where people can volunteer and say, I'm available to help. I'm a COBOL programmer and I'm available. And then the people who need COBOL can look at the databases and use that as a resource. So we're trying to connect the need for expertise with the people who have the expertise who are available. And I'm not sure what the current status is, but we're doing a lot to help out.
Wow, so COBOL nowadays is becoming even a glamorous skill to learn now with all this, all these resources.
It is to me, but there are still programmers who just can't stand it, and I don't know why. I guess it's like a fashion thing. You know, a beautiful dress to one person is an ugly dress to another person, right?
Yeah. To each their own.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, every person has their own opinions, and they're all okay as long as they don't try to push them on everyone else and start bad-mouthing COBOL from a podium where a lot of people can hear them. That kind of bugs me.
Yeah, of course.
If they have facts about it, if they've written COBOL and worked with COBOL and there's things they don't like about it, that's okay. But the thing about it is, when our customers find things they don't like, they tell us about it, and we fix things. We change COBOL all the time. For example, mainframe COBOL is very different in 2020 than it was in 2019. We've added a whole bunch of new features, and we do this constantly. And sometimes we add features in between releases by our service stream, like fix packs or whatever you want to call them. On mainframe, they're called PTFs, where we send a package of corrections or changes to a product. And we can add new features within a few months of them being requested. So we're very, very dynamic in responding to suggestions about how to make the COBOL language better. And we've been doing it every year for many, many years.
Wow. So I feel like we just dispersed another myth. And again, COBOL is not a dragon. It changes, it evolves, and it's being rewritten. So basically, I heard COBOL became object-oriented in early 2000s, because I feel like there is a misconception, like almost a myth that exists among general public, that COBOL is the same that it was in 1950s and 1960s, and probably that's what generates such a bad reputation for it amongst the general masses. But apparently, again, it could not be further from truth, because COBOL does evolve.
Very much so. And it starts with the standards committee. We have a very strong standard that makes COBOL it forces COBOL to be platform independent, and that's why we can have COBOL be portable from mainframe to Windows to Unix, to you name a platform, and it has COBOL running on it. And the COBOL standard is so strong that the language runs the same on all the different platforms. And the standards committee is regularly updating. The first standard was 1968, and then there was 74. Then there was the 1985 standard, and then the 2002 standard in 2014, and now they're working on the 2020X standard. So even the standards are traditionally not very dynamic, but because they have committees that have to decide on the future, and it's very difficult. It's a lot of work. But they're still coming out with new COBOL standards on a regular basis.
Wow. So I remember even like before the DevOps term occurred, there was such thing as an integrity. Sometimes you would feel like developers just threw their code over the fence. It worked on their machine, but it doesn't work on your machine. But it turns out that with COBOL is not the thing. The concept of DevOps is basically encapsulated in COBOL just because of its interpretability and of its working across a variety of platforms.
Yeah, that's a little bit true. That because of the standard, it's kind of ideal for DevOps, and in that it's not platform specific.
Wow. So if it worked on one machine, it will have to work on the other machine, basically.
In a lot of cases, that's very true. Now, in reality, sometimes COBOL programs are just containers for SQL statements for database access, and that can be very platform specific. So the COBOL itself, the pure COBOL part, is platform independent. But for example, if I have exec kicks statements to access the kicks transaction monitor, then that's going to be specific to the systems that Kix supports. And Kix does run on a lot of different platforms as well, but it relies on IBM shipping a Kix product for that platform. For the pure COBOL without Kix or SQL in it is portable, and there are many different vendors who sell COBOL compilers for different platforms, and because of the standard, those are consistent. But then you get into individual things like files systems could be different on platforms. So data access is quite often a bit of a challenge. But the part of the COBOL that's processing numbers and characters and such is absolutely portable.
Wow. This is incredible. So I almost wish like most school taught COBOL nowadays, because I know my school didn't. Now I feel shorted.
It's an interesting challenge, but like I said, I think that IBM's doing a great job. There's another company that sells COBOL called Micro Focus, and they're also working with universities to make sure that the universities are aware of this need, and so that if they choose to not have COBOL, they know it's not necessarily a good decision. They know that it's important to have COBOL education, and if they choose not to, then that's a negative on their university, rather than just having them make their own decisions without any knowledge of what's going on in the world. So we're trying to help them to make an educated decision. If they decide not to do COBOL, then they know the consequences.
Of course. But if students do decide to learn COBOL on their own, do you have a resource in mind? Maybe it's a book or an article, or maybe an online course besides the course that IBM offers that maybe you could recommend?
Not off the top of my head. That's a good question. There are many, many books on COBOL. If it was me, I Googled COBOL education the other day and found a whole bunch of resources. I couldn't make a recommendation, I'm afraid. I haven't done them myself, but I wouldn't imagine, I think any of them could be okay. I hope there aren't bad COBOL books out there. Most of the people who write about COBOL are fairly passionate about it, so I think almost any of them would be okay.
Yeah, I feel like passion is a very important component of delivering quality education.
Yes, yeah. Yeah,
so,
if you care, then you can do a good job in your book and your education.
Absolutely, 100%. So I feel like if there is anything good to come out of this pandemic, is just new exposure of COBOL programming language, and hopefully the rekindling of students' interest in it, because turns out COBOL is a language of the future and it's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, that is a good side effect. The negativity has been kind of a bummer, but an executive in IBM named Barry Baker put out a really nice article about that COBOL is not the problem, but we are here to help, and COBOL is definitely important and in use and relevant, and IBM will do anything we can to help out with these people. But just saying that COBOL is the problem is not a correct statement. But it
yes,
is getting
actually,
shared.
I did read a good article about it the other day. It was written by Sven Gregori on Hackaday.com, and it's called "That COBOL is Not the Problem and the Crisis is Misinterpreted." At
Yeah.
first, I didn't understand what it was about, but after some digging and after our conversation today, that I was like, oh, I have to agree with it based on the facts.
Yeah. It's true. So it has raised, it's given COBOL some press, hopefully not all negative, but sometimes even negative press is better than no press because it's still here. COBOL's still here and it will still be here.
That's definitely a great point because positive or negative press, it generates exposure and consequently generates interest. Because the reason we are even talking about COBOL today, because so many people wrote about it on LinkedIn, either positive or negative.
Yeah. Yeah, it's brought out a lot of the supporters and detractors. And so it's got it into discussion, which is kind of cool because quite often, if I'm at a party or something and I say I work on a programming language called COBOL, and people say, "Oh, I've never heard of it." Now, a lot of people have heard of it.
Wow. Yeah, I feel like it made a lot of people start Wikipediaing COBOL, and even Wikipedia actually has a pretty exhaustive article on COBOL.
Yeah, I was reading it the other day, and I kind of disagree with. I was thinking about trying to do some edits on it myself to make some corrections because it was saying things like people are rewriting their COBOL into more modern, and that's really not true. That is not happening. There's a little tiny bit of it. And I know of many cases where companies have tried to rewrite COBOL and failed. Quite often, the famous joke is when I'm talking to my clients, they'll say, well, we don't want to work too much on this application because it's going to be replaced. And then we chuckle, we laugh because some of these applications were intended to be replaced 10 years ago and 5 years ago, and they're still trying to replace them, but they can't because they're so reliable and they get the job done, and they're still using them 15 years after they had decided to get rid of them. So they just don't go away. It's really, really hard to write something as good in some other language. So they can't, and they don't. And we've also heard of customers who have lost a lot of money trying to rewrite their systems to follow trends. One very large retailer was running everything mainframe, COBOL, DB2, and they decided that an executive came up and he was going to run. His career was going to fly on the idea that they're going to get off of the mainframe and off of COBOL. So they rewrote everything for Unix, bought a bunch of Unix servers, wrote a whole bunch of new code, new database, and they actually got it running. They spent some $10 million on this project, and they got it running, and it was working, and they were tuning it, but no matter what they did, it was 10 times slower than the mainframe solution. So what ended up happening was they abandoned the project. They wrote off the $10 million mistake. They fired the executive who had the idea, and they got a new mainframe and new COBOL and new DB2, and they're still running just fine. But the tragedy is, to me, they did not share this mistake with the world because they don't want their shareholders to know that they wasted $10 million on this stupid idea of trying to get off of COBOL and mainframe. And I've heard of other customers with the same situation. No one wants to share these mistakes, so no one learns from other people's mistakes. It's tragic. And so whenever a customer says we're thinking we're going to move off of the mainframe and off of COBOL, I think, oh no, don't even try it. But sometimes they do anyway, and they lose a bunch of money. It fails, they give up on it, and they go back to COBOL and mainframe.
Oh my God, I feel like we should talk more about it in the media. It would save companies a lot of money and embarrassment, apparently. And we would be more like, everything would be more synchronized in terms of technological development. It would pay off for everyone to be on the same page.
Yes, I agree.
So, and if the Department of Labor was to deviate from COBOL, it probably wouldn't end well, just like in the case of the company that you just mentioned. They would
Right.
spend a bunch of money and then it would not work.
It wouldn't work as well and not as fast, and it would be a tremendous amount of money spent, and the system would be worse when they were done spending all the money. So yeah, how does that help?
Not at all. So basically the professionals that the EDD website needs right now is not necessarily COBOL programmers, because there is no shortage of them there. COBOL code is there and it runs and everything works. But the department needs people to maintain the web server to prevent those spikes and crashes in the future.
I think that's a possibility. In the case of New Jersey, I'm not 100% sure. I've heard some analysis that said that the bottleneck was the web services, the web server part. And I can't comment on whether they have enough COBOL programmers. Some of the comments I've heard is that governments often are not as good about keeping their applications current and fresh and updated and competitive, because there is no competition, for example, for unemployment insurance in New Jersey. So they're the only, so they don't have to be better. If I'm selling auto insurance, I need my applications to be better than the other auto insurance company. So I hire lots of COBOL programmers to make sure that they are better. And when we have new ideas, we can implement them in our COBOL applications. So I don't know if New Jersey has enough COBOL programmers or not. And I don't think that COBOL is the problem, but they need to get people in to analyze the situation, and they might not have enough people for that. I think they're bringing people in to look at it. I'd love to know the details of exactly what's going on in New Jersey unemployment insurance right now.
So it's basically its lack of urge of improvement is caused by the monopoly-like nature of the EDD website, because it's not like people are going to go to the competitor.
Right, and that is that. I heard that as a general comment, and I think it's possibly true that for a government, it's kind of how good their systems are is based on the integrity of the individuals, building the systems. There isn't necessarily, or whether the governor of the state is pushing on them to make improvements, or if they have a feedback loop where their users can come back and say, you need to improve this part of your system. In business, where you have the competition, it's built in that your business relies on you having better systems than the other businesses to compete. So yeah, so it could be that's part of the problem, that the governments are not necessarily incented to keep things as good as they could be.
Wow, this is amazing. It's such an eye-opener. Thank you. I'm so grateful to you for today's discussion. It cleared up so many things, and I'm pretty sure it will clear things up for so many people out there.
Great, you're very welcome. I hope it does help.
Thank you very much. It was quite a pleasure.